Picture a man who has already lost his career, his marriage, and very nearly his life to alcohol, sitting across from someone offering him a way out, and hearing that same man say, without hesitation, "I'd rather die than fake a belief in God I don't actually have." That wasn't a rare reaction among the earliest members of Alcoholics Anonymous. It was, for a great many of them, the exact wall they hit the moment anyone mentioned a higher power. And here is what makes this chapter so remarkable. It wasn't written by religious believers trying to convince skeptics to abandon their skepticism. It was written largely by former skeptics themselves, men who had once said the exact same thing, and who found a way through that same wall without ever pretending to believe something they didn't. By the time this chapter was written, the earliest members of the fellowship had already encountered, repeatedly, one of the most predictable and most difficult obstacles standing between struggling alcoholics and any real chance at recovery. The assumption that getting sober through this particular approach required embracing a specific religious framework, complete with all the doctrine, institutional baggage, and traditional imagery that so many people, for entirely legitimate reasons, had already rejected. For intelligent, independent-minded people, and there were many among the early membership, doctors, lawyers, businessmen, engineers, people who prided themselves on evidence and reason, this assumption alone was often enough to end the conversation before it had really begun. The chapter doesn't respond to this resistance with argument or persuasion in the traditional sense. It responds with something far more disarming, total honesty about how common and how understandable that resistance actually was. Many of the men who eventually became pillars of the early fellowship had walked in the door as committed agnostics or outright atheists, often for reasons that had nothing to do with alcohol at all. Some had grown disillusioned with religious institutions they'd encountered earlier in life, institutions that seemed more concerned with ritual and judgment than with anything resembling genuine help. Some were simply committed, on intellectual grounds, to a strictly rational and material view of the world, and saw any talk of spiritual power as, at best, wishful thinking, and at worst, a kind of surrender they weren't willing to make. What the chapter does next is worth sitting with carefully, because it represents a genuinely unusual move for a book largely concerned with recovery from addiction. Rather than trying to talk skeptics out of their skepticism, it validates it. It acknowledges directly that a great deal of what passes for religious teaching had, understandably, driven thoughtful people away, and that intellectual honesty was not an obstacle to recovery but, if anything, an asset. The book makes a point of saying that it has no interest in imposing any specific set of beliefs on anyone, and that the whole point of what follows is not indoctrination, but an invitation to examine an experience that even the most skeptical among them had, in fact, already had, whether or not they had ever named it in spiritual terms. To understand this move, it helps to look at the specific argument the chapter builds, piece by piece, starting from a very simple observation. Nearly everyone, regardless of religious background, already operates every single day on the basis of belief in things they cannot directly see, measure, or prove through immediate sensory experience. A person trusts the electricity flowing invisibly through the walls of their house. A person trusts abstract scientific concepts explained to them by others, concepts they haven't personally verified through experiment. A person trusts other human beings, forms, loves, and commitments based on evidence that, if examined with pure logical rigor, is never entirely airtight. The chapter uses these everyday examples deliberately to demonstrate that human beings, including the most rigorously rational among them, already live according to a kind of practical faith constantly, whether or not they use that word to describe it. From here, the chapter makes a further move that turns out to be central to everything that follows. It separates the concept of a higher power from any specific, predetermined definition of God. This distinction mattered enormously to the early membership, and it remains one of the most quoted and most important ideas in the entire book. The invitation was never to adopt someone else's specific conception of God, complete with someone else's specific theology. The invitation was simply to become willing to believe in some power greater than oneself, defined, however, that individual person needed to define it in order to begin the process of recovery at all. This distinction sounds subtle, but its practical effect on struggling alcoholics was enormous. A man who couldn't accept a traditional, personified conception of God, shaped by whatever specific religious tradition he had grown up rejecting, might nonetheless be able to accept something else entirely. The fellowship itself, functioning as a power greater than his own isolated willpower, which had already failed him repeatedly, or the sheer, undeniable order and complexity of the natural world, something he could acknowledge intellectually without needing to attach any particular religious label to it, or simply an open, honest admission that something beyond his own individual reasoning and self-control was needed, without yet being able to name exactly what that something was. The chapter tells the story, without using real names in the way later retellings sometimes have, of a man who had spent years describing himself as a convinced atheist, a man of genuine intelligence and real accomplishment who regarded all talk of spirituality as beneath serious consideration. This man's resistance to the entire idea of a higher power was not a passing objection. It was, by his own account, one of the most deeply held convictions of his adult life. And yet, according to the chapter, even this man eventually found his way to some form of reliance on something beyond himself, not through being argued out of his atheism, but through direct, lived experience, watching other alcoholics, whose situations had seemed every bit as hopeless as his own, recover in ways that his own intellect alone had never managed to produce for himself. Somewhere in that direct evidence, something shifted, not as an abandonment of his intelligence, but almost as an extension of it, a willingness to follow the evidence of what actually worked, even when it didn't fit neatly into his previous framework. This point deserves emphasis, because it's easy to misunderstand what this chapter is actually asking of the skeptical reader. It isn't asking for blind faith, in the sense of believing something without any evidence at all. It's asking for something closer to intellectual honesty applied consistently. If a rational person is willing to trust evidence in every other area of life, even evidence they can't personally verify through direct experiment, then that same rational person should, in principle, be willing to examine the evidence sitting directly in front of them, the transformed lives of people who had been every bit as hopeless as they were, and consider what that evidence might actually be pointing toward. The chapter is also careful, and this mattered enormously to its earliest and most skeptical readers, to distance itself from any suggestion that this process required a sudden or dramatic conversion experience, of the kind Bill Wilson himself had described in his own story. For every case of a sudden, overwhelming spiritual experience, the chapter notes, there were many more cases of something far more gradual, a slow, incremental willingness to consider the possibility of something greater than oneself, growing quietly over weeks or months, through the ordinary experience of staying sober, watching others stay sober, and participating honestly in a community built around mutual honesty, rather than performance or doctrine. This gradual path, the chapter insists, was every bit as valid and every bit as real as the dramatic version, and for the majority of people who found lasting recovery through this approach, it was actually the far more common experience. There's a particular phrase embedded in this chapter that captures its entire underlying philosophy with unusual precision. The idea that what was being asked of the reader was not a leap into blind faith, but simply an open mind. Complete atheism, the chapter suggests, required just as firm a conviction as complete religious certainty, an unwavering commitment to a specific and absolute conclusion about the nature of reality. What the fellowship was actually asking for was something different from both extremes. Not certainty in either direction, but honest, humble openness to the possibility that something beyond one's own individual willpower might exist and might be able to help, even without yet knowing exactly what that something was, or what to call it. This openness, modest as it sounds, turned out to be enormously difficult for many of the men described in this chapter, precisely because closing off that possibility had, for years, felt like a mark of intellectual strength and independence. Admitting even the possibility of something greater than themselves felt, to many of them, uncomfortably close to admitting weakness, to surrendering the very self-reliance that had defined their identity long before alcohol ever became a problem. The chapter addresses this discomfort directly, reframing it not as weakness but as a different, and ultimately more honest, form of strength. The willingness to set aside pride long enough to try something that had already been shown, through direct and repeated evidence, to work for people who had been every bit as convinced of their own self-sufficiency. What emerges across the accounts collected in this chapter is a consistent pattern, one that varies enormously in its specific details, but converges again and again on the same underlying structure. Each of these men arrived deeply skeptical, sometimes hostile, toward the entire concept of spirituality. Each of them had legitimate, often deeply personal reasons for that skepticism, reasons the chapter never dismisses or minimizes. And each of them, without abandoning their intelligence or their capacity for honest doubt, eventually found some workable conception of a power greater than themselves, often one that looked nothing like the conventional religious imagery they had rejected years earlier. And that conception became the foundation on which their actual recovery was built. The chapter closes by returning to the practical stakes of this entire discussion, stakes that mattered enormously to every reader who had picked up this book, precisely because every other approach they had tried had already failed them. The argument here isn't primarily theological. It's practical, almost clinical in its framing. Self-sufficiency, relying purely on one's own intellect and willpower, had already been tried, exhaustively, by every single person whose story fills these pages and had already, without exception, fallen short. Something more was needed, not as a matter of religious obligation, but as a matter of simple, observed necessity. And that something, the chapter insists one final time, did not require abandoning reason, discarding intelligence, or accepting anyone else's specific religious doctrine. It required only enough humility to remain open to a possibility that pure self-reliance on its own had already proven insufficient to solve, and enough honesty to let that openness be defined however each individual person, in their own time and in their own words, eventually came to define it for themselves. As we come to the end of We Agnostics, we are confronted with one of the most important questions in recovery. What happens when a person no longer believes that there is any power capable of helping them? For many people struggling with alcoholism, this question is not theoretical. It can be deeply personal. They may have stopped believing in themselves. They may have stopped believing in other people. They may have stopped believing that their life can change. And perhaps, after years of disappointment, they may also have stopped believing in God or in any kind of spiritual power. Maybe they have asked for help before. Maybe they prayed. Maybe they tried to change. Maybe they promised themselves that they would do better. And after repeatedly returning to the same destructive patterns, they may have concluded, "Nothing can help me." That conclusion can become one of the greatest obstacles to recovery. Because if you believe there is no solution, why would you search for one? If you believe you are beyond help, why would you ask for help? If you believe that everything depends entirely on your own willpower, what happens when your willpower fails? This is where the message of We Agnostics becomes so powerful. The chapter is not simply asking the reader to accept a religious doctrine. It is asking the reader to become willing to consider a possibility. What if there is something greater than my own understanding? That question may sound simple, but for someone who has spent years trying to control everything, it can represent a profound change in perspective. The alcoholic may have spent years believing, "I can handle this, I can control this, I know what I am doing, I don't need anyone," and eventually life demonstrates the limits of that belief. The problem is no longer simply alcohol. The deeper problem can become the insistence that everything must be solved through one's own limited understanding and power. We Agnostics challenges that idea. It invites the reader to become open, not necessarily certain, not necessarily religious, not necessarily able to explain exactly what they believe, just open. And perhaps openness is where recovery can begin. Because you do not need to have every answer before you take the first step. You do not need to understand everything about spirituality before becoming willing to explore it. You do not need to have perfect faith. You may only need enough willingness to say, "I don't know, but I am willing to find out." That sentence can be incredibly powerful, because "I don't know" is not necessarily a dead end. It can be an open door. "I don't know" means there is still something to discover. "I don't know" means I am not completely certain. "I don't know" means I am willing to listen. "I don't know" means perhaps my current understanding is not the complete picture, and for a person who has spent years trapped inside rigid thinking, that openness can be transformative. Perhaps one of the most important lessons of this chapter is that faith does not necessarily begin with certainty. Sometimes it begins with curiosity. Sometimes it begins with desperation. Sometimes it begins with a simple experiment. I am willing to act as if there may be something greater than myself. And then the person begins to experience something different. They attend meetings, they talk with other recovering alcoholics, they begin practicing honesty, they begin helping others, they begin taking responsibility, they begin making amends, they begin praying or meditating, perhaps even without knowing exactly what they believe. And slowly, through experience, something may begin to change. This is important because recovery is not only about intellectual arguments, it is also about experience. You can debate whether a spiritual life is possible. You can debate whether God exists. You can debate what the nature of a higher power might be. But ultimately, a person may need to ask a different question. What happens when I become willing to live differently? What happens when I stop insisting that my own way is the only way? What happens when I become willing to listen? What happens when I become willing to ask for help? What happens when I begin to serve instead of constantly trying to get? What happens when I become honest instead of hiding? What happens when I stop trying to control everything? These experiences can become more important than abstract arguments, because a person may not be able to explain exactly what they believe, but they may be able to say, "Something has changed in my life," and perhaps that is where spirituality becomes real. Not merely as an idea, but as a way of living. For someone who is agnostic, this can be especially important. The chapter does not require them to pretend they believe something they do not believe. It invites them to remain open to the possibility that their current understanding may not be complete. That is very different from forcing certainty. There is a difference between saying, "I believe everything," and saying, "I am willing to explore." The second statement may be all a person needs at the beginning, because recovery is a journey. It is not a test that you must pass before you are allowed to participate. You can begin with doubt. You can begin with questions. You can begin with skepticism. You can begin with anger. You can begin with confusion. You can begin with almost no faith at all. What matters is willingness. And perhaps this is one of the most hopeful messages of the chapter. You do not have to believe perfectly to begin recovering. You only have to become willing to consider another possibility. Maybe your own way has not worked. Maybe your own understanding is limited. Maybe another way of living is possible. Maybe there is a power greater than yourself. Maybe that power is understood differently by different people. And perhaps you do not need to define it completely today. For many people in recovery, their understanding of a higher power develops over time. It changes. It becomes more personal. It becomes less about intellectual certainty and more about lived experience. For some, that higher power may be understood through traditional ideas about God. For others, it may be connected to spiritual principles. For others, it may initially be represented by the fellowship itself. The important thing is not necessarily having identical beliefs. The important thing is recognizing that we do not have to remain trapped inside the belief that we alone must control everything. And perhaps that is one of the most dangerous illusions of alcoholism, the illusion of self-sufficiency. I don't need anyone. I can handle it. I will fix it myself. I don't need help. But addiction can eventually destroy that illusion. And although that realization can be painful, it can also become an opportunity. Because when we realize that our own resources are not enough, we become open to resources outside ourselves. We become willing to accept help, We become willing to learn. We become willing to trust. We become willing to surrender some of our need for control. And perhaps surrender is one of the most misunderstood concepts in recovery. Surrender does not mean giving up on life. It does not mean becoming passive. It does not mean refusing to take responsibility. It does not mean allowing other people to control you. Instead, surrender can mean giving up the exhausting struggle to control what you cannot control. It can mean accepting reality. It can mean admitting, my way has not worked, and then asking what other way is available. That question can change everything, because once you stop defending the old way, you can become open to a new one. And perhaps that is what happens to many people in recovery. They begin with resistance, then curiosity, then willingness, then experience, then trust, and eventually perhaps faith, not necessarily blind faith, not necessarily perfect faith, but a practical faith, a faith that says, I don't have to understand everything to take the next right step. That kind of faith can be incredibly powerful, because life will always contain uncertainty. Even people with strong beliefs do not know exactly what tomorrow will bring. No one has complete control over the future. No one can guarantee that nothing painful will happen. No one can eliminate every fear. So perhaps the question is not, can I become completely certain about life? Perhaps the question is, can I learn to live meaningfully even when I do not have all the answers? That is a much more realistic question. And it is especially important for people recovering from alcoholism, because the obsession with certainty can become another form of control. The alcoholic may want guarantees. Will this work? Will I stay sober? Will my life get better? Will my family forgive me? Will everything be okay? But recovery does not necessarily provide guarantees. It provides a path. It provides tools. It provides fellowship. It provides principles. It provides the opportunity to live differently today, and perhaps that is enough. You do not need to know how your entire life will unfold. You need to know what you can do today. You can be honest today. You can stay sober today. You can ask for help today. You can attend a meeting today. You can help another person today. You can practice gratitude today. You can make a responsible decision today. You can choose not to return to the life that was destroying you today. And perhaps spirituality becomes real in those daily choices, not in what we claim to believe, but in how we live. Because a person can speak endlessly about faith and still treat people terribly. Another person may have doubts about God and yet live with extraordinary honesty, compassion, humility, and service. This reminds us that spiritual growth is not merely about having the right words. It is about becoming a different kind of person. And perhaps that is the real invitation of this chapter. Not simply believe, but become willing to consider, become willing to listen, become willing to change, become willing to ask for help, become willing to let go of old ideas, become willing to discover that life may contain possibilities you cannot yet see. For the alcoholic who feels hopeless, that willingness can become the beginning of a new life. Because hopelessness says, nothing will change. Willingness says, I am willing to see what happens if I try another way. And that small difference can be enormous. Perhaps someone listening to this chapter today is still struggling with the question of God. Maybe they do not believe. Maybe they are angry. Maybe they are skeptical. Maybe they have been hurt by religion. Maybe they have tried to pray and felt nothing. Maybe they simply do not know what they believe. If that is you, perhaps the message is not that you must suddenly have all the answers. Perhaps the message is simply, stay open. Do not let your uncertainty become an excuse to stop searching. Do not let your doubts convince you that recovery is impossible. Do not assume that because you cannot explain something, it cannot exist. And do not confuse lack of certainty with lack of possibility. You can begin where you are, with whatever belief you have. With whatever doubt you have, with whatever hope you have, even if that hope is very small, because sometimes a small amount of willingness is enough to begin. And perhaps, over time, experience can become faith. A person who once believed that nothing could change begins to experience change. They become sober, they repair relationships, they become useful, they help others. They discover peace in places where they once expected chaos. They learn to face problems without alcohol. They begin to trust themselves in a healthier way. And eventually they may look back and realize, something happened that I could not accomplish by myself. That realization can be deeply spiritual, not because someone gave them an argument, but because they experienced transformation. And perhaps that is the ultimate message of we agnostics. You do not have to begin with certainty. You can begin with honesty. You can begin with doubt. You can begin with questions. You can begin with desperation. You can begin with a simple willingness to consider that your own way may not be the only way. And from there, a journey can begin. A journey away from isolation, away from obsession, away from self-reliance that has become destructive, away from the need to control everything, and toward connection, toward humility, toward service, toward responsibility, toward spiritual growth, toward freedom. So perhaps, as we close this chapter, the most important question is not, do I believe in God? Perhaps the deeper question is, am I willing to believe that my current understanding may not be the whole truth? If the answer is yes, then there is an opening. There is a possibility. There is somewhere to begin. Because recovery does not require that you know everything. It asks you to become willing to learn. It does not require that you have perfect faith. It asks you to take the next step. It does not require that you understand spirituality completely. It asks you to become open to the possibility that there is something greater than your isolated self. And perhaps that is enough. Enough to walk into the next meeting. Enough to speak honestly. Enough to ask for help. Enough to stay sober for another day. Enough to discover what happens when you stop insisting that you must do everything alone. Because sometimes the greatest spiritual breakthrough does not come when we suddenly find all the answers. It comes when we finally stop demanding that we have them, and we simply become willing to search, willing to listen, willing to change, willing to live. And perhaps that is where the journey from agnosticism to spiritual awakening can begin. Not with certainty, but with willingness. Not with perfect faith, but with hope. Not with all the answers, but with the courage to ask the next question. And for someone suffering from alcoholism, that may be all that is needed to begin discovering something extraordinary, a life beyond the bottle, beyond isolation, beyond hopelessness, and beyond the belief that you have to face everything alone.